what I wanted to do before introducing her is just to say very quickly thank you to our co-sponsors. They're on page 3 of the booklet. I wanted to recognize the Center for Latin American Studies, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Confluence Center for Creative Inquiry, Confucius Institute at the University of Arizona, the College of Humanities, and the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. We also have co-sponsors from other language resource centers. Circle is a language resource center funded by the federal government. There are 15 of them in the US, and several of them have helped. The Center for Advanced Language Proficiency Education and Research, otherwise known as CALPER at Penn State University. The Center for Advanced Research and Language Acquisition, Carreira, at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Center for Applied Language Studies, Castles, at the University of Oregon. The Center for Open Educational Resources and Language Learning, or CORAL, at the University of Texas, Austin. And the National Heritage Language Resource Center, NHLRC, at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. We're very happy that the other centers and then various centers here at the university have helped us with putting this conference on. Okay, so our plenary speaker, and I really want to thank her for being willing to switch from tomorrow to today. So I'm very honored to introduce to you Dr. Maria Carreira of Cal State University at Long Beach. She is co-director of the National Heritage Language Resource Center, NHLRC, at UCLA, which is co-sponsoring this address. NHLRC was founded to create a research base for the field of heritage language education, develop effective pedagogical approaches to teaching heritage languages, and pursue curriculum design, materials development, and teacher education. Dr. Carreira is co-author of 4 Spanish textbooks for heritage speakers, including Si Se Puede. Her research focuses on Spanish in the US and Spanish as a heritage language. Her forthcoming book, Voces, Growing Up Latino in the US, is an annotated collection of writings by Latino youth on their experiences in school, home, and their communities of residence. Her talk today is on heritage language teaching, bridging the gap between what is and what should be. Please give a warm welcome to Dr.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for doing it.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you, first of all, to for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to the organizers of the conference for inviting me, and thank you to all of you for coming here. I know after lunch is a hard time to be here. So there's the title of my presentation, and I'd like to call attention to the gap between what is and what should be, because that is what I'm going to be addressing today. Is the microphone, it's right there? Oh, you probably gave it to me.
It's right here. You just speak right into it.
But she wants to move.
Thank you.
Okay.
And the clickers there.
Oh, wait, thank you. So in this presentation, I am going to start out by looking at what it is that we know about heritage language learners, as well as heritage language teaching, with an emphasis, of course, on the topic of our conference, ICC. And then from there, I will give some suggestions as to what we should be doing to tap into the full potential of heritage language learners, and I should say all language learners. First, a very brief word about the National Heritage Language Resource Center, because you already got to hear about it, so it makes my job easier. So we are one of 15 language resource centers, and you already heard about our mission, so I don't need to do that. Some projects that you might be interested in, we have professional development workshops. We have an online free access workshop, and every summer, hopefully this summer again, we'll have a Start Talk workshop for teachers, a week-long Start Talk workshop for teachers. You should check our website if you're interested so you can apply and participate. And I want to call attention to our latest project, the teaching newsletter, which is soon to be released at our upcoming conference, March 7th and 8th at UCLA. I left some flyers out there with information about our conference. I hope some of you can make it. All right, back to the topic of this presentation, what is and what should be. Presentation of what is, which is the main part of my talk today, will proceed as follows. First, I'm going to look at heritage languages learners' practices surrounding their HL and their HC. And to do that, I will use two sources of information: a survey that the National Heritage Language Resource Center conducted, and my research, this forthcoming book, Voces. After that, I will look at the value of these practices. I will have a brief discussion of the value of these practices that they engage in, and more generally, their ICC, their competence, their intercultural competence. And I will close the presentation, I will close the first part of the presentation by looking at instructional practices regarding the teaching of HL learners. So I will compare what it is that we're doing for HL learners to what it is that they do and need to be able to do. So why should we care about heritage language learners? Two reasons. One is demographics. The other one is possibilities. Let's start out with demographics. 22% of children in the US speak a language other than English at home. That's a remarkable number, right? 1 out of 5, right? What about Arizona? Does anybody know what it is in Arizona? 29%. 29%. Take a look at other states. 45% where I come from, California, right? And these numbers obscure something even more drastic, more dramatic. In LA, it's much higher. LA Unified is 79% Spanish children that speak a language other than English at home. All right, so you can see we should care, if nothing else, because of our numerical presence. But of course, there's a lot more than that, right? Whoops. There are the possibilities that come up when we look at this population. This population possesses valuable linguistic and cultural skills. And the value, I'm going to define value at 3 levels. I'm going to show value at 3 levels. Value at the personal level, value for society, and value for our profession. We will see that they stand to make great contributions to the teaching of foreign languages. So typically, when we talk about the HL learner advantage, the focus is on their language skills, and rightly so, because they do enjoy a significant advantage. Lately, there's been a lot of work by linguists on the grammatical systems of heritage language learners. The articles I'm citing here all come from an issue of the Heritage Language Journal that I highly recommend if you're interested in this. And in it, there are 2 articles, one by Silvina Montrul and Legro and Polinsky, that look at this competence, what it is that heritage language learners can do in terms of grammar. And they show very clearly that heritage language learners perform more like native speakers with regard to many, not all, aspects of language. As a matter of fact, with regard to some aspects, L2 learners outperform HL learners. But with oral production tasks in particular, and things that are learned early in life, I'm talking about accent, of course, some morphological processes, these things that are learned very early in life by children, HL learners vastly outperform L2 learners in that regard. In the journal issue, we also have an article by Cynthia Martin that looks at how they perform with regard to the OPI. And she finds that HL learners typically start at novice, high, intermediate, low, mid-range, in that general category. Of course, L2 learners don't start out that high. That's already a very high step to start out with. And naturally, it makes sense that they progress to advanced and superior levels faster than non-HL learners. Dan Davidson has a great article about that on the Russian flagship program, what they can do with HL learners in the Russian flagship program. My focus today is on another kind of HL learner advantage, and that is the ability to negotiate challenging situations in their daily lives and to help others do the same. Before I do that, I just want to quickly go over some definitions. You probably know these already. The term heritage language speaker, there's a very popular definition of it by Guadalupe Valdez, refers to somebody who speaks the language. How well they speak it, how bilingual they are, is not clear and can vary. But it refers to somebody who has some measurable skills in a home language. There's also the term heritage language learners, where the focus is not on whether they speak. As a matter of fact, you may not even speak the language, but you engage in learning and you exert agency to connect with this language. So the point of this is that not all HL speakers are HL learners, right? You can be an HL speaker because you grew up speaking the HL language, but you're not a learner because you're not engaged in studying it. And vice versa. Not all HL learners, people who are studying the language, are HL speakers, right? All right. For most of what we do in the study of heritage languages, this is where the focus is, where the overlap is between the speakers and the learners. Why is that? Well, because we teach, there's the learner part, students, and we want them to speak, to learn to speak. So that's where the focus is. A second priority, and especially lately, more so, has been on HL speakers. These are non-instructed learners. The focus on these learners has been mostly by linguists who want to understand what happens with languages in what they call the wild. If you don't receive instruction in languages, so how do you learn it? What is it that you develop and what is it that you do not develop? But from the point of view of teaching, this group really has not been on our radar for obvious reasons, right? They don't come to our classes. They're not learning in a classroom situation. There's also this group, and there's been a little bit of writing by Sarah Beaudry, for example, and Cynthia Ducar. They talk about these learners because most courses ignore these learners. There's very little done both in HL teaching and L2 teaching for these learners. And yet we know, based on demographic realities, we know that this group will grow in the next decades. Back to this population. So I'm going to use two sources of information on this population's language practices: the NHLRC Learner Survey and my own research. Let's start with the Learner Survey. This is a survey, we already published the results in 2010. This is a survey of heritage language learners who also happen to be heritage language speakers, so where the overlap is. That overlap I mentioned earlier. And you can see there some of the specifics. And our primary objective, this is what I want to highlight, was to gather information to inform the design of curriculum, materials, etc. And that's how I'm going to use it today. You can see we surveyed learners from a vast array of languages, although Spanish and Chinese predominate. And I'm going to present the findings, and because I have very little time, I'm really going to focus on language practices. Excuse me. All right. So, language practices. The question we asked is, or we wanted to get at is, what is it that they do with their HL? There's a theoretical framework behind this question. And that framework is one that is premised on the notion of translanguaging. Translanguaging is nothing other than the language practices of bilinguals. Ofelia Garcia and Lei Wei have a wonderful new book just on translanguaging, and also Garcia's 2009 book talks a lot about translanguaging. Translanguaging is a perspective that sees language as action and practice, not a simple system of structure, a fixed, static system of structure and discrete skills. Notice the word languaging, right? It turns language into a verb, not keeping it a noun, right? So the focus is on action. So So just to help you think about translanguaging, because from experience I know the concept is a little bit difficult to imagine, it has some overlap with the idea behind the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, where the ACTFL proficiency guidelines are focused on what you can do with language, right? Able to speak the language with sufficient to participate in effectively in most formal and informal, conversations, sorry about that, the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. But there is an important difference, a critical difference, and that is that the ACTFL proficiency guidelines ask what can they do as a means of assessing. Translanguaging asks what do they actually do as a means of learning about this population, informing, teaching practices with this population, etc. You can see that even though there's some overlap, they are quite different, right? The answers to this question, what is it that they actually do, are very important because they give us insight into HL learners' needs and strengths, as well as the value of heritage languages to individuals, society, and what I want to get to at the end are departments, right? All right, so first time we asked the question, what is it that they actually do? This was a startling observation or finding for us, because everybody knew, of course, that the use of heritage language declines as people get older. It peaks before they start school and steadily declines. That makes sense, right? These kids are living in the real world, right? And so it makes sense that they're not going to be using their HL most of the time. We predicted what we see with English. What we did not anticipate was the yellow line, where they say, we use both. Notice that continues to peak, and then it just stays pretty steady well into adulthood. So what they are telling us is that they translanguage, that they go back and forth between their two languages. To find out more about this, we had two open questions in the survey. The first question was, how has your knowledge of your heritage language affected your experience in school? And we asked them to give us an incident, to relate an incident. And how has your knowledge of your heritage language affected your experience outside of school, for example, in your home, church, or neighborhood? And again, to relate an incident. We want very concrete stories here. Here's some interesting findings. First and foremost, they tell us that they use their heritage language to connect with their peers. So you can see it here. This person is feeling lonely and is able to connect to somebody before she's able to function well in school, before she has the language skills to function well in school. Helping others is also a big theme that comes up time and time again, that they use their language to help teachers, administrators, and to gain favor that way, by the way. And then we also hear that they help the learners understand the world that they inhabit, and that understanding translates into helping others understand. So we get words like, it's made me a global citizen, a more open-minded person, more curious of the other, etc. And then we also get this type of thing where they talk about connecting with family, connecting with older relatives, connecting with the community. And because I'm making my way towards talking about the value of heritage languages, I want to emphasize just how important this connection is. We don't often talk about it when we talk about heritage language learners because we focus on learning, right? But psychologists Carola and Marcelo Orozco, who are now at UCLA, Marcelo is the dean of the School of Education at UCLA, have written a lot about the importance of heritage languages and cultures from the larger perspective, not just the perspective of language learning, from the larger well-being and educational progress of immigrant children. And you can see what they say here. Immigrant cultures are the repositories of beliefs and attitudes that are conducive to success, such as respect of family and authority, deference for education, and optimism about the future. So you can see the value of maintaining those connections to peers and family members. These answers, you can see, help explain something that was a surprise to us, that heritage language learners are incredibly optimistic about their language. Look at you get the answers they gave. Almost 90% said it's a valuable skill, that they find it useful, it's an important part of who they are, and 52% that helps them make more friends. Very positive attitude, right? However, we should not think that their experiences are all positive. Far from it. And now I'm going to move into my research, what I have found. So this is from the forthcoming book, it's coming out this year, Voces, where I interviewed hundreds and hundreds of students, in some cases asked them to write, and I followed up interviewing some families. And what I asked them to do, I asked them to relate an experience involving their heritage language or heritage culture in their community, work, home, etc. I left it open for them. I got some really interesting answers. I'm just going to show 3 of them. They're a little long, but I find them so remarkable that I have to read them to you, even though they're long. The first one, let me read it. Every couple of months, my high school would have a peer court. This is quite remarkable, where students would determine the punishment of their peers that had done minor crimes. The accused would stand in front of their parents and the peer judges and talk about what they had done. Sounds medieval, doesn't it? On one occasion, the person who translated for parents who didn't speak English couldn't make it, and the teacher asked me to fill in for her. I immediately accepted. I love the idea of helping out. The day came, and I was introduced to the parent I would be translating for. I was a bit nervous and didn't want to say the wrong things. I saw the woman's face and felt her shame and fear. She had been through one of these situations before. When it was my turn to go on stage, my insides felt like they were going to drop. My Spanish helped me console the mother and to give her a voice and some dignity before the group. When it was over, I realized how much I had been able to help this family out because I knew Spanish. I was proud to be able to help, although I felt very sad for them. You can see this is translanguaging at its best, right? Here's some of the elements of communicative competence, intercultural communicative competence that this student shows. Here's another anecdote. A few years ago, my family took a road trip through Utah over the Christmas holidays. It seemed that this would be the perfect vacation spot for our family, but things did not turn out so well. An incident at a store will forever remain in my memory. My cousin and my little sister and I went to the corner store to buy some treats. We were speaking Spanish. We were standing in line to pay. A man behind us sneezed, and I said to him, "Bless you." Much to my surprise, he gave the children and me a look of disgust. Not liking this, we decided to leave the store. As we reached the door, we heard the man say that Mexicans were dirty and that we should all go back to Mexico. I resolved that I would be respectful to a fault and told him he should think about how his words would impact the children. When we got home, I explained to the children that this man was ignorant and said there were things he didn't know about Mexicans. I explained that even when people are disrespectful to us, we should be respectful to them. Most of all, I made sure that the children understood that Mexicans are not dirty, but that we are respectful people. That day, I learned how to deal with Americans who say insulting things in front of Mexicans who understand English. Remarkable, isn't it? The last one is much lighter. The elements of ICC, well, ability to manage incredible psychological stress. I'm not sure I would have been so controlled, and I'm probably old enough to be this girl's grandmother, I don't know, but it's remarkable how she handled the situation and how she took advantage of it to teach her nieces and nephews about how to act. All right, the last one is it's a little lighter, but also very indicative of an amazing competence. One thing I have noticed is that Latino parents usually don't have American friends, and American parents don't have Latino friends. Because these two groups don't get together, they don't get to know each other. My parents are very protective of me. The funny thing is that my parents didn't even realize they were strict. They just thought that that was a normal way of being. This is because they only talked to other Latino parents who acted the same. They knew nothing about how American parents viewed things or behaved. I had a friend, Gabriela, whose parents my friends had known for over 10 years. One day, I asked them if I could sleep over at her house, and they said no. Another time, a friend named Karen asked to sleep over at our house. Karen just picked up her phone and called her mom. Just like that, the mom said it was fine. My parents asked me when Karen's parents would be calling to talk to them. They became confused when I told them that they were not going to call. I told them that they already knew because Karen had told them. Still confused, my dad insisted, but don't they want this is like a bad movie, you know, you're watching a movie and then the electricity goes out. Let's see, Karen asked me what was going on and I told her. I don't remember her exact words, but she said something to the effect that my family was a little weird. That's when I realized that my parents don't understand how they look to American parents. I realized that my parents did what they did to protect me, but Americans don't view this behavior as an act of caring. They view it as worrying about insignificant things. Beautiful analysis, right? And again, we see elements of intercultural competency. So this brings us to the question of value. I don't think I need to tell you. You can see it's obvious, it's plain what the value is. So there's value to self. We see the learners understanding the worlds that they straddle, as well as understanding the perspective that the worlds have of each other, right? And we see them negotiating the challenges that come from living between two languages and cultures. And we see them with the ability to pick the best from each culture, right? There's also value to others, value to society and to other individuals. We see them acting as language brokers, language and cultural brokers, in addition to helping out in the other ways I mentioned earlier. Incidentally, what's in parentheses is in anticipation of what I'm going to come to later when I talk about the advantages for foreign language departments. We see that these are exactly the kind of skills that we need our social workers, healthcare professionals, business professionals to have. And these are the skills that we can develop in our foreign language courses. So let's look at instructional practices. And now I'm going to use evidence from another survey. That is the program survey. The survey is still ongoing. But I already have a paper that I can point you to with preliminary results. And this was a survey of foreign language programs. Many of you filled out the survey. I thank you for that. And our goal was to create a searchable database of information on programs that teach heritage language learners. Not necessarily programs that have heritage language courses, specific heritage language courses, simply heritage language learners. We want to know what they do with those learners. I should point out that this is a collaborative project with the Center for Applied Linguistics. The Center for Applied Linguistics is handling K through 12, and we are handling post-secondary. So eventually, anybody will be able to come into the site and look at what's being done across the nation, across levels. So number of respondents, 312 programs, 27 languages, 34 states of all demographic types, and you can see it's a wide array of institution types. So here's what to us is one of the most important findings, is that 47%, it looks from what I'm presenting, is that it's almost 50-50, the presence of mixed programs that have specialized HL language courses, that's 47%, and programs that have mixed classes, that is classes with L2 learners, at 52%. I'm going to tell you why that's deceptive, but before I do, I want to just mention this finding that customized options are rather common to our delight, and they seem to be well tailored to the needs of heritage language learners. We didn't know that departments were actually doing this as a solution to meeting the needs of heritage language learners. So what we find, going back to this issue, I said, you know, it looks like it's 50-50, not really. Because look at the difference between languages. Arabic is 7% don't only have HL courses. Spanish has 80%, but I have doubts about that number. You can see Chinese is about 50%, Farsi 34%. So this, I think, overrepresents the existence of HL courses because the large majority of languages do not have. Everything is skewed because Spanish is so large, right? But another thing is that survey respondents are more likely to be interested in HL issues, so they're more likely to have HL courses. Sarah Baudry conducted a survey where she actually went through course catalogs of institutions in the Southwest, and she found something like 46% of Spanish programs in the Southwest have HL courses. So I think it's reasonable to assume that mixed classes are the norm in HL teaching. So we have a grave disconnect here, because everything we have been doing for the last 20 years in heritage languages has been focused on teaching HL learners in HL classes. And lo and behold, that's not what's happening, right? So the question we have to ask is, well, what's happening in mixed classes? What is happening to these students? What do we know? Actually, we know nothing about these classes, right? We're just starting to ask these questions. Some questions. Are curricula, classroom practices, and materials premised on the language and cultural practices of HL learners? Do they address these students' needs and build on their considerable skills? So once again, I'm going to use two sources of information for that. The program survey, and I'm going to use a language textbook. So from the program survey, we learned that there are 3 instructional configurations where HL learners are being taught. Type 1 is where there are very few HL learners. So you'll have a class, 30 students, 1 or 2 HL learners. Type 2, HL learners are a sizable minority. You know, I'm talking between 10 and maybe 40% of the class. This is the most common type. And then type 3, HL learners are a majority. In some cases, we have programs where HL learners are a super majority, meaning more than 75%. So what happens in these types? Well, type 1 and 2, we asked teachers to fill out all sorts of answers, and they openly said that they don't pay attention to HL learners. I'll show you in a second. Types 2 and 3, we find time and time again, the teachers told us they just apply L2 methodologies, materials, etc. Here are some examples. This is from, the first one is from a type 1. I did not give particular consideration to HLs. They're usually a very small segment of the class. Type 2, name of book does not address the needs of HL, but it does a good job at the beginning level where the majority of our students take the, I don't even want to give away the language, as a general language requirement. So no care being taken of the needs of heritage language learners. More materials from the survey. We found, in fact, that many HL classes reported using L2 materials. This is true even in languages like Spanish and Chinese and Russian, where there are a good number of books for HL learners. Another finding was that no mixed classes use HL books. The pattern, the practice seems to be, if you have a mixed class, you're going to use an L2 book, even if you have a super majority of HL learners. Can you imagine? And we found only 1 respondent out of 300 and some programs that used materials specifically designed for mixed classes. I should give this respondent credit, Tri Tran from the University of California at Irvine. He's written a textbook for Vietnamese speakers in mixed classes. The second source of insight comes from a foreign language textbooks, and I'm going to use mine, not to do self-promotion, but because I'm going to criticize it. And so I'm more comfortable using my book, criticizing my book, also because I know it better than anything else. I think it's pretty representative of what happens in Spanish textbooks. I can't speak to what happens in other languages. So the book I'm talking about is my first year book, Nexus. I have it right here. Right. And it's a 3rd edition, so you'd think by now we'd have it right. We don't. But let me start with a positive, right? Here's what we do that's right. We have an emphasis on dialectal variation, that's good. We have an emphasis on languages in contact, Spanish and English, Spanish and the Amerindian languages, good. We talk about Spanish in the US, we feature Spanish speakers, we talk about demographics, professional and social opportunities, the contributions of favored Hispanics. It's pretty good, right? But what we don't do is much more important than what we do. What's missing is a translanguaging perspective. And that perspective puts a focus on the contact zones, the contested spaces. We talk a lot now about contested spaces, right? The spaces between languages and cultures, rather than on the monolithic autonomous systems. That approach places emphasis on the fluid nature of actual and local practices of all speakers, the agency of speakers, how it is that they decide what they're going to do, right? And the multiple and fluid identities of bilingual students and the strategies that come along. Ophelia Garcia has a great metaphor. She says, well, we need to teach these students, we need to view competence as an all-terrain vehicle. Where you know what an all-terrain vehicle does, right? I looked up all-terrain vehicles, so I wanted to give you a picture of an all-terrain vehicle, and I didn't like what I saw, because a lot of it seemed military, right? So I said, well, what would be a better picture? I think you'll agree with me that this is a better picture. Remember this wonderful movie, right? This is an amazing car. This car could do anything, remember? And the wonderful thing about this car is that her Truly Scrumptious, remember Truly Scrumptious? Truly Scrumptious had a fancy car, but it kept getting stuck in the pond, right? It couldn't go through that terrain, that rocky terrain. It was chitty chitty bang bang. The car put together from lots of little pieces from everywhere. The hybrid car, in a different sense of the word hybrid, that made it through that terrain, and that flew and that made it through water. That's how we need to conceive of teaching heritage language learners. That's what's missing in the books. So back to these questions. Well, it's doubtful that we're doing that, right? I'm just going by my book and the survey, but based on that little bit of evidence I have, I can say it's doubtful that we're doing any of that. In fact, I would say it's very doubtful. Consequences of this state of affairs, well, you can see the learners don't get to develop what they have, which is incredible, right? Society doesn't get to profit from what they have, and foreign language departments miss out on incredible opportunities, right? Foreign language departments can increase the pool of advanced students, diversifies course offerings, make connections to other fields and departments, become more relevant to the professional formation of large numbers of students in a university. We're missing out on great opportunities, right? Now, in the last 5 minutes, I'm going to turn, it's about 5 minutes, right? Turn to what should be, and I'm going to focus, well, very little, of course, with 5 minutes, on instructional practices, materials, curriculum, and teacher training. All that in 5 minutes? Not really. So what should be, you can see where I'm going, that all these things should be premised on the perspectives of translanguaging and transculturing, right? What does that look like? You probably say, yeah, sounds good, but what does that look like? Well, instructional practices that tap into HL learners' competencies and funds of knowledge that help learners deepen their understanding of and their ability to navigate their languages and put their skill to the benefit of others. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to give you an example of that at the end. That's what I'm going to close with. Another thing we need to be doing is developing strategies and curricula for the two extremes, these two types of learners. HL learners who do not speak their HL, we know from various studies that have been done that they are invisible in foreign language departments. They're put in L2 classes and treated like L2 students, even though they do not feel like L2 students, and they have considerable cultural knowledge and motivations, not to mention motivations. This is something Nelike has written about in their HL, right? We have to start validating them and infusing our L2 courses with the kind of knowledge that they bring to the classroom. In terms of speakers who are not learners, these individuals, for whatever reason, and we don't know because we haven't studied these learners, don't see value in continuing to study or studying their language at all. We need to put effort into finding out why they're away, what keeps them from enrolling in our classes, and we need to figure out what kind of curricula would attract them and would make learning meaningful to them. For these learners, I should say that these customized options that are becoming so popular may be a good way to attract them, right? If they're interested in taking professional advantage of their skills, these customized options might be very helpful. So I'm going to close with what I promised I would do. I am going to give you a concrete example of what this means in the foreign language classroom. Typically, we read something about a culture, and then we have a discussion, right? There's a reading about some cultural unit, and then there's a culture. What do you think would happen in your classroom if you brought up this story that I already read to you, where it's in the store, the Mexican saying, "Go home, dirty Mexicans," and the girl reacting, and what kind of conversation would follow? they would all be engaged, right? And the heritage language learners would be giving their perspective in a mixed classroom as to what should be done. The L2 learners would be giving their perspective. There would be a real heated exchange, but a valuable exchange. I dare say they would be very motivated to use their language, to listen, and to participate. This is what the transcultural curriculum looks like. It draws on the learner's experiences, and it uses it to build knowledge. And with that, I will close and say thank you very much.
We now open it up to questions, but since you're being streamed live, could you raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
Oh, do you want? No.
Probably hear me better anyway. I'm from Alabama, and we have not, until in the last 10 or 11 years, had a significant number of students in our public school system that were not English speakers.
Right.
And typically in Montgomery, the two largest groups are Koreans and Mexicans. The last 2 years has been, in my Spanish classes, the first time I'm seeing heritage language learners in my classes. And these are generally advanced classes, and we've had a placement system for those. But you're right, it's still an L2 classroom. I don't apologize for that.
Right. No, right.
But
Yeah.
we have a little talk beforehand about, how to be an HL in an L2 classroom. And usually that comes off very, very well. But my question for you is, I am at 0 right now, pretty much 0. What would be your suggestion for the first thing that I could do to bring those speakers into that learning classroom?
These are your speakers. These are your students. Right? So that's the first thing I would say to them. I find I have interviewed hundreds of people. I just interviewed another person yesterday and I learned something new. I couldn't believe it. So I'm constantly learning from, so you say at 0, I'm not that much better, and I've done hundreds of these. Ask them. So I start every semester, I start my classes by saying, write something down for me, an experience that you want other people to know about, something that sticks in your mind. And these form the basis of class discussions and class assignments. So it's with heritage language learners, you want to start from where they are and where they need to be, not where we, as traditional foreign language teachers, and I'm one myself, think we should take them, right? So it's learner-centered is a big issue in foreign language teaching. I don't know if I answered your question. Yeah, you want to ask your students to tell you about these experiences, if they want to.
Well, I mean, the Latino kids come and hang out in my office, but to get them into a classroom where we can take advantage of their skills,
Right.
they can learn things from us. I can't get
Right.
that volume.
Right. Now, typically what is done, and frankly shouldn't be done, is to put the HL learner to teach the L2 learner, right? And that shouldn't be done for 2 reasons, because HL learners are not language teachers. They don't know what they're doing, right? But a second reason is they should be learning too, right? So if you go to the Heritage Language Journal, there is an article, I can get it for you, the only study that I'm aware of that has done an actual paired study, a study of pair interactions. There's a lot more coming out now. At the conference that's coming up at UCLA, there are quite a few papers on that. Paired interactions. And Melissa Bowles comes up with some very good ideas for how to handle paired interactions. What you need to do is pair so that my strengths are your weaknesses and your weaknesses are my strength. So to give you an example that she uses, heritage language learners are good at speaking, L2 learners are good at writing. So you force the heritage language learner to write under the guidance of the L2 learner, and you force the L2 learner to speak under the guidance of the HL learner. So you force them to do what they're weaker at, and you ask the other one to correct or guide the interaction. That's sort of an idea.
I have a question to myself.
Oh, from there. Oh, that's me.
No.
Oh.
It's you, and the question is mine. one thing I wanted to add, if I can, to
Yes.
the conversation that was going on here.
Please.
A lot of heritage language learners have an opinion of a linguistic self-concept very influenced by dominant ideologies about language and multilingualism. So one part we start at is having them talk to you about how they feel about their languages, and many things start coming up. And it is a place where we can reinforce how valuable whatever I always tell them, look at the half full part of the glass instead of the empty where sometimes they go or tend to go. So, and as soon as they start valuing their command of the heritage language, they become an asset in the classroom, clearly, right?
Right.
And
We'll get them to say, well, I can't come to your classroom, I don't speak properly.
Exactly.
Yeah, but you do.
Exactly.
we're speaking now
Yeah.
in a way that's
Yeah.
fluent,
I
that
can
we don't get.
understand you, yeah.
Yeah. Although, I should tell you, in Alabama, Peggy Billbro, do you know Peggy? 15 years ago, already invited me to go and give talks for teachers. So you might I don't know if she's still doing it. She might have retired by now, but she was very active in this area. She was a pioneer, really,
I have a question of my own.
Yeah.
I teach here at U of A in a very large and successful program we have with heritage language learners. However, I teach in advanced classes and writing classes. So my question is, how do we promote translanguaging? How do we focus on the contact zones? How do we value languages in contact and the contact zones with the pressure of acquisition of the standard language, with the neutral and maybe overvalued neutral Spanish?
Right. That's very difficult for language teachers to do, because we're so used to separating languages and promoting the standard variety and thinking about getting the students up to the next level where they can read literature and write using proper language. But it's so important, as you mentioned it. So it's almost heresy what I'm going to say, but I start out the semester by asking them to write a small portion of the preamble to the Constitution of the United States in Spanglish. And it's a wonderful exercise. First of all, it lets them know I love Spanglish. Hey, I use it all the time. And second, it's taking ownership. When you write it in Spanglish, you are taking ownership of this living document, right? And you're rewriting in a way that makes sense to you and that reflects your realities, your concerns, etc. So I would say just relaxing the classroom that way. Sandra Cisneros has a poem. It's called Make Love to Me in Spanish, but it's written in English. Can you imagine? Make love to me in Spanish, but she writes it in English. So I say to the students, hey, rewrite it any way you want to. Rewrite it in Spanglish, rewrite it in Spanish, whatever you want to do with it, but let's improve on this for heaven's sake. And they come up with some wonderful things. So we play with language a lot, just to let them know that language is not the sacred object that you can't touch. It belongs to you. You do whatever you want with it, right? I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, what I feel should happen is accept as teachers, with all the ideology we bring to our the practice of our profession, that owning your language, owning whatever you speak, is the first step to going anywhere else in terms of a new variety. And I think we don't spend enough time in those heritage language classes on what the students have.
Yes, and Martha Fairclough talks a lot about this. She's a researcher in Spanish as a heritage language, and she just says you have to start out. Every heritage language course has to start by validating what they have, the practices that they have, what they do with language, the knowledge that they have. You can't move on to the next step. If you want to teach them the standard, you won't get there by rejecting what they do. You only get there by validating, acknowledging its value, and then moving on from there if you want to. It's not clear. Not everybody thinks they should move on to learning the standard. I won't go there because I realize this incites a lot of discussion, which we don't have the time for.
Other questions? I had a comment myself.
Oh.
I really love the use of trans.
Oh.
In a sense that
Not trans fats, though.
For the reason that inter implies a defined boundary of language and culture, whereas trans implies that by interacting, they're changing each other.
Right.
And that is the flow.
Right.
It's constant changing.
Right,
I
right.
don't want to steal this mic if anybody has questions.
Yes, I don't want to take away anybody's time from a question, but I do have an anecdote from my sister. My sister, does anybody have a question before I go on to talk about my sister? I don't want to. Okay, so my sister arrived in the United States at age 4. So she's one of those early arrivals. Her Spanish is not, or did not used to be that great. She went to law school, she's a lawyer, and eventually she got a job as the head of a law firm, the head of a Latin American division of a law firm. And I said, well, how'd you get this job? I mean, I didn't say you don't speak Spanish that well, but that's kind of the implication, right? And she got the implication, and she goes, oh, that's easy. I'm the queen of the boundary. And I go, what are you talking about? She goes, I don't speak Spanish anywhere near as well as the lawyers from Latin America. And on English, sometimes the American lawyers know a thing or more, or two more than I know. But in the overlap, when they meet, I am the best one at bridging that gap and going back and forth and telling one group what it needs to do to be heard better by the other group and vice versa, telling what group what not to do to the other group. And she says that's why they hired her. Not for her ability to conjugate the pluperfect subjunctive, which she can't, I don't think, but because she can do this other thing so well. Yeah. Yes?
I had more of a practical question
Mhm.
with the survey results that you were presenting, in the sense of, we know that with
Oh, yeah, maybe, yeah, sorry, I should have given you.
we know that with self-reported data, we need to be
Right.
a little careful on how to
Right.
interpret the results. And so I was wondering if perhaps with the instructional part of the survey that you conducted, were instructors provided with examples perhaps on the type of pedagogy that entails to teach HLs? Because I'm wondering if there was only one person, if they understood more or less what it entails.
So we had program directors answer the question. So we did not go to the faculty that teach the courses, but the program directors. We talked to them. We made sure, actually, that there was that understanding. We did not ask them to put labels on what they did, but rather to explain to us what they did. And we asked them to give us the names of books that they used. There's a group of people that are working on this project, is not me. So for instance, in the case where they gave us the name of a Chinese book, we had the Chinese specialists look up the books, so they know the books ahead of time, and check what it is, what kind of books they are. So we did check for that. As you say, when it's self-reporting, there are always dangers of misrepresentation, misunderstandings, etc. You're right about that. Okay.
If there are no other questions, we will close and thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.